This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for being here. Before we get started, I wanted to mention that we are part of the Flux Media Network. So go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about religion, politics, technology, and society, and how they all interrelate and have built the world that we currently live in. And if you like what we're doing, you can also support us by going to patreon.com/discoverflux. And this show is also going to be available on Substack as well, if you are interested in subscribing on that way. And there are different options available to you if you want to subscribe on Patreon, and you can also subscribe on Substack. So I really appreciate everybody who is supporting the show, because these deep conversations that we're bringing you are difficult to produce in terms of production and booking. We need your support to continue doing that. So please do support what we're doing. And the first part of this conversation is going to be available to non-members in video and audio. But if you're a member, you'll be able to get it in the complete conversation in video and audio as well as text. So again, you can subscribe on Patreon or on Substack. So appreciate that very much. Thanks a lot. All right, so with that out of the way, let's get into today's program. There is a growing body of scholarship and journalism about the American religious right, the powerhouse of far-right Christianity that rules the Republican Party from the highest reaches of the Supreme Court to the lowest reaches of the county precinct chair people. The religious right is usually regarded as a political phenomenon only, a manifestation in politics of religion. But it is more instructive, I think, to look at it from the opposite side. That is, the doctrines that animate the Christian right. Where do they come from, and who are they responding to? Because it gives you a better viewpoint as to how they are doing things and what their objectives are. This perspective is not included nearly enough in our political discourse. And to help us with that, I'm going to bring in somebody who has written a very fascinating new book. His name is David Hollinger. He is an emeritus professor at the University of California-Berkeley, and he's got a new book out called Christianity's American Fate. It is a short book and definitely worth your while. It's a unique offering in the publishing marketplace, so I cannot recommend it enough. So with that said, David, tell us, first of all, in the introduction, you make a remark that I think is very important, and that is that a lot of people who are not religious tend to have no interest in hearing about religious doctrine and think it is of no consequence to them. You disagree with that in your introduction. Tell us why.
I think that because of the large role Christianity has played in the United States and continues to play, even though we're experiencing fairly rapid secularization right now, the ideas that are put forth in the name of Christianity and the people that fly the Christian flag have a lot of influence in the society. So that's why everybody has a stake in who controls Christianity in the United States. And it has seemed to me, Matthew, that the literature that we have doesn't focus enough on this matter of what Christianity is and has been and where it's going. So you might say that we've got a lot of books, and many of them very good, on Christian nationalism as such and what its threats are to democracy. And we've got quite a few books closely allied on why did evangelicals flock to Trump. Well, those are good literatures, but almost never do those books and articles and op-ed columns ask the question that I designed my book to answer, and that is, how is it that Christianity, a massive and multifaceted aspect of American life since the founding of the country, how did Christianity end up taking the form that it has now, the shape that it has now, and performing the role that it does now? So that I wanted to do a longer term historical understanding of this and try to explain how we got there, and also to underscore the importance of religion in this. So your opening point is very important to me and gets at something that's very basic to this book. I think that if there is any one takeaway that I would like people to have from this book regarding that question, the question of how Christianity takes this form, we need to remember that the evangelical Protestantism of our time, including its very strong Christian nationalist manifestation, we need to understand that all of this develops not in a vacuum, but it develops as a process by which the people that we have come to call evangelicals and call themselves that have rejected an alternate version of Protestantism that was readily available to them. Another version of Protestantism that took a much more capacious view of what Christianity is, that was much more responsive to a pluralistic society. And I'm talking, of course, about what we sometimes call the main line, the old-fashioned Protestant establishment, all those Presbyterians and Episcopalians and Methodists and Lutherans that were very prominent in American life right down through the 1960s. Now, this is a group that pretty much controlled what Protestantism was until relatively recently. Now, these people, these liberal Protestants, these ecumenical Protestants, these mainline Protestants, during the 1940s, developed a very ambitious program for trying to respond to changes in modern life. And they take a strong stand against Jim Crow and racism throughout the United States. And they take a strong stand against colonialism and imperialism abroad. They developed in the 1940s a program to develop a more cosmopolitan Protestantism. Now, as they do this, a lot of rank and file Protestants, especially those coming out of the fundamentalist tradition, are uncomfortable with this. So evangelicalism develops as a response to the liberal Protestants, the ecumenical Protestants' campaign for a more cosmopolitan Protestantism. Basically, the evangelical formation as we have it today, this whole tradition leading to to Christian nationalism, this develops as a safe harbor for white people who want to be counted as Christians without facing two challenges that the leadership of the mainline Protestants say you really have to face. You've got to face these challenges if you're going to be a Christian in the United States of the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. Two challenges. First challenge, all these liberal Episcopalians and so forth are saying, first challenge is, we live in an increasingly diverse society, an ethno-racially diverse society. We have to have a response to this somehow. We have to deal with it. We have to confront its injustices and do something about it. Second challenge, we live in an increasingly science-informed culture. So learning, education, science, very important to understand. And we have to have a religion. We have to have a version of Protestantism, a version of Christianity that takes this into account and responds to it. So the old literal reading of the Bible, the sort of stuff that the fundamentalists used to do, that's just not viable anymore. So these are two challenges that the liberals are saying during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, got to do something about. Now, many white people were uncomfortable with this. They are uncomfortable with having to face those challenges. Evangelicalism flourishes as a safe harbor for white Americans who do not want to face those challenges, but are determined to be counted as Christians.
so in terms of the history, the challenges and they're trying to reformat Christianity in America, but they're doing it in response, in large measure, to their contact with other traditions of religion, both Christian and non-Christian, which they encountered themselves through missionizing, through greater contact with Europeans. And Christianity in Europe changed quite a bit. Before that, there's a saying that people, say that, God died on the first day of the Battle of the Somme in World War I. And, and so Europe was going through a tremendous amount of religious change internally. And you had the advent, especially in Germany, of scholarship that began to question the text of the Bible itself and the emergence of the documentary hypothesis, such that that it became evident that the Bible was not, especially the first several books of it, were not the product of one person. In fact, they were the product of many people, and it was a hodgepodge of traditions that were shoved together. And
Absolutely.
And so though, and you do talk about also that when they were performing missionary work in other countries that were non-Christian, that changed things for them as well. Can you talk about both of these two developments?
Yeah, if we were to ask the question, why is it that these liberal Protestants became so determined in the 1940s to launch this campaign for a more cosmopolitan Protestantism? There are several things in the background there. And one is the larger development of thought in Europe, of the analysis of the Bible, the historicization of the Bible, the development of a liberal approach to Christianity. That's certainly going on. And the leaders of these denominations are educated in seminaries during the 1920s and 30s, where they learn all that stuff from the Germans. They really do learn that. But there are two more immediate things that really push these folks in the 40s. And one of them is the foreign missionary project. So beginning in the 1890s, especially, when a lot of missionaries go abroad, the American missionary project goes back earlier to the 19th century. But from about 1890 to 1940, thousands of these American Protestants go to China, India, the Middle East, Japan. And the thing about them is that they come back. I mean, they went abroad to make the rest of the world more like American Protestants. But while they're abroad, they tune in to a lot of different things, and they become more respectful of diversity. They become more respectful of non-Christian religions. And so they, and especially their children, come back to the United States, come back to their churches, come back to their denominational assemblies, come back to their schools and colleges, and they criticize the provinciality of American life generally and of American Protestantism in particular. So one thing that drives them is that they are determined to create a Protestantism that is more responsive to the diversity of the world. They discover through the missionary project that the expanse of humanity is much broader than just a lot of sort of vacant beings who are there just waiting for the benevolence and the instruction of American Protestants. Rather, these people have cultures and societies that are substantial and that we need to take account of, and from which we might even learn something from. So that's one thing. Second thing that's more immediate, that's happening at the same time, is Jewish immigration. So you have a small number of Jews in the United States, about 4% of the population in 1920. That continues down through the World War II era. But the thing about the Jewish migration is that it's culturally prominent. Jews, unlike the Catholics, and there are many more Catholic immigrants than there are Jewish immigrants, the Jewish immigrants achieve rapid upward social mobility. And they also have a much higher level of literacy, much higher education than the Catholic immigrants do. And many of them bring from the old world artisanal skills and commercial experience. So as a result, you have a population of non-Christians who achieve rapid social mobility. And by 1920, like between a fifth and a quarter of the population of New York is Jewish. Now, this then continues down through the 20s and 30s. And then in the 30s, when you get all of these intellectuals, all these people like Einstein, so forth, coming in from Europe, that adds another dimension to this. Now, the point about these Jews are not so much that they're Jewish or even Judaic, and many of them are not Judaic, actually. They're often very secular. The thing about them is they're non-Christians. So for the first time in American history, you have a conspicuously present, a very prominent cultural presence in the United States that doesn't even share a Christian background. Now, the Catholics, they're at least Christians, okay? So the notion of America as a Christian civilization, you can somehow accommodate that even amid the rampant anti-Catholicism that's very common among Anglo-Protestants. But the thing about these Jews is that they're not even part of a Christian background. So as a result, they constitute a challenge to Anglo-Protestant cultural hegemony in the United States. This is especially seen in the universities. Jews are subject to a lot of discrimination before the 1950s in American universities, to be sure, but they're prominent enough. So the most educated of these Protestants, the people that are running the Methodist Church, the people that are running the Episcopal Church, the ones that are sensitive to what's going on in the missionary project, they are also sensitive to the diversification of American life. Now, at the same time, of course, they're aware of Jim Crow and the evils of discrimination against Black people. But what really hits these people afresh is the Jewish migration. So the Jewish migration and the missionary experience abroad are sort of twin influences to move these people in a more cosmopolitan direction. And the way the Black population then comes in is that they realize that one of the first things they have to do is to address racial injustice in the United States. So they begin bringing in Black leaders. So people like Howard Thurman, Channing Tobias, Benjamin Mays. By the early 1940s, these really prominent Black intellectuals and Black preachers are brought into the leadership of the Federal Council of Churches. Now, this whole project is pretty much a top-down operation, in other words. So if you go into the average Methodist or Presbyterian church in Kentucky or Missouri or even Pennsylvania or California, you're not going to find a really strong emphasis on doing away with Jim Crow. You find some of that, but this is a top-down operation where you might say the ecumenical intelligentsia, educated in biblical scholarship, really struck with the significance of the missionary experience abroad and surrounded by all of these smart, well-educated, articulate Jews from the migration from Europe. They're affected by all of this, and they want to do something about it because they think that the kind of Protestantism coming out of the fundamentalist tradition and being enunciated by some of the evangelicals of the 40s just doesn't get it. And it's indeed in response to this campaign for a more cosmopolitan Protestantism developed in the wake of these conditions that I've described, that evangelicalism as we know it comes into being as a point-by-point refutation and opposition to the ecumenical mainline liberal Protestants. Give you some institutional examples. In 1942, we have founded the National Association of Evangelicals, which is designed as a lobby group to contest the influence of the liberal Protestants through the Federal Council of Churches. We have then, in 1947, Fuller Theological Seminary established in California to counteract Union Theological Seminary, Pacific School of Religion, Harvard Div School, all these liberal seminaries. In 1956, you have the founding of Christianity Today, founded to go against the Christian Century the liberal Protestant house organ. So it's institutionally specific, and it's connected also with right-wing political money. It's interesting that Christianity Today gets its start when one of the big oil magnates, Howard Pugh, gets fed up with the liberal Protestants because he doesn't think that they're fighting against the tradition of the New Deal. No. So Howard Pugh takes all of his millions and millions of dollars, which he's been supporting the liberal Protestants, and gives all this money over to Billy Graham and Billy Graham's dad, and they found Christianity Today, and they support a lot of these evangelical operations. So evangelicalism comes out of a religious conflict, no question about it, but it's also supported by right-wing political money that understand very early on that this is a constituency that they can use.
Yeah, exactly. And just give a little background on Howard Pugh a little bit, who he was, and he wasn't the only person involved in this, is it?
No, he wasn't, but he was the richest. And he was also the most explicit. So the National Council of Churches, which is a pretty strong operation in the 1950s with many denominations affiliated with it, they are taking a pretty strong egalitarian line, and they support the traditions of the New Deal. And they think there's too much economic inequality in the United States. And they like to quote the Sermon on the Mount. So Jesus of Nazareth seems to think that everybody ought to be treated equally. And Howard Pugh, he thinks this is a mistake. And so he organizes a lot of Presbyterian and Episcopalian businessmen, and they constitute a committee, which he calls the National Lay Committee, to influence the National Council of Churches, to get them to adopt laissez-faire principles. We should not have government regulation of the economy at all. So he presses this, and the leaders of the National Council of Churches won't have anything to do with this. So there's a fight on political grounds, and it's at this point that Pugh moves his millions over to the other side. Now, there are other people that are involved in this. There's actually a couple of very good books on that. I mean, Kevin Cruz has a very good book on the economic conservatives and the growth of the religious right. Darren Doshik also has an excellent book on this. So that particular episode is quite out there and well discussed in the literature. What I think is not understood as widely is that the religious motivations that a lot of the evangelical Protestants have at this time, religiously, they're attacking an alternate religion, an alternate Protestantism. They're attacking a Protestantism that is friendly to the New Deal, that is friendly to African Americans, that is critical of American foreign policy in the world. In 1958, the National Council of Churches is by far the largest American organization to come out in favor of the diplomatic recognition of the People's Republic of China. Now, Howard Pugh has a conniption. I mean, at this point, a lot of the right-wing people, and including Christianity Today, they're outraged. Billy Graham's dad tries to get the Congress to investigate the leading Presbyterians that are in favor of the recognition of the diplomatic recognition of Red China. So there's a quarrel going on, which involves a lot of these rich people, but it also fundamentally involves a different understanding of what Christianity should be. So Billy Graham comes along. He's very important all the way through the 50s and 60s, prominent even in the late 40s. But he's crucial to understanding this, because Billy Graham says you've got to accept Christ, and people go to his altar to accept Christ. Well, what does that mean? Well, above all, it means that you can accept Christ without worrying about Jim Crow. You can accept Christ without worrying about imperialism. You can accept Jim Christ without worrying about economic inequality. You can accept Christ without worrying about science. You can accept Christ without worrying about how the different books of the Bible were written. You can accept Christ if you're loyal to your spouse, you help your neighbors when they need it, you follow the golden rule, you avoid same-sex relationships, you avoid pornography.
Well, and you say that you accept Jesus into your heart.
That's true. Yeah. So what I'm getting at is that there are a series of things that you can do that are actually not so demanding. Now, that brings up a important argument among scholars about the history of Protestantism during that period. I don't think a lot of people who haven't read about that history even know about this controversy, but I'll tell you that in 1972, there's a book published on why Protestant churches are flourishing, and this book argues that why evangelical churches are flourishing. This guy's argument, 1972, is that evangelicalism is flourishing because it makes demands. Ecumenical Protestantism is declining, as it was by 1972. Ecumenical Protestantism is declining because it doesn't really make demands on people. Now, I'm arguing in my book that this is entirely wrong. So I reverse that and I say ecumenical Protestantism meets these challenges and is more demanding, and a lot of people would migrate over to the evangelical churches because the evangelical churches are not demanding that. So the thesis, I think, should be that evangelical Protestantism is less demanding than ecumenical Protestantism. Evangelical Protestantism provides a safe harbor for people that want to avoid the stricter demands of that time. So I think that's an important part.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that because I was going to bring it up, but like, it's the idea that the doctrines of Christ in terms of paying attention to the least of these thy brethren, or doing unto others as you would have them do unto you, that you have to consider that all the time in your actions, and also in terms of who you support politically. So, and that was not something that, that this emerging, what later became, overtly right-wing, politicized religion, they didn't want to accept that. And it's almost, and there's a kind of a parallel when you look at, they kind of say similar things to, into celebrities. So like, entertaining celebrities, they tell celebrities, shut up and sing. Don't tell us about morality. Don't tell us about, of course, there's a much greater irony in the fact that they're telling pastors not to tell them about morality.
Well, and the you have to remember that the evangelical line on these things is that all that's politics. That's not religion. So worrying about Jim Crow, that's politics, and we shouldn't get involved in that. Whereas the ecumenicals are coming along and saying religion has been always embedded in politics. We can't avoid a political challenge if we want to be true to our faith. So again and again, you would find evangelical preachers calling out the liberals for substituting politics for religion. This is a constant theme that you hear all the way through. I think a very striking and emblematic episode for this is in 1963, after Martin Luther King Jr. gives his famous speech, the I Have a Dream speech in Washington after the big March on Washington. Billy Graham is asked what he thinks about this. And Graham says that the little white children and the little black children of Alabama will walk hand in hand only when Christ comes again. So that's making a religious obligation, but it's so distant So people don't have to do anything as Christians now because we don't want to get religion involved in politics. But in the long run, we know that racism is bad, but we also know that we're not going to do anything to change it. If we do anything, it's going to be piecemeal, doesn't amount to much. So yes, there's a huge divide between ecumenicals and evangelicals having to do with a lot of these issues in the society. And the ecumenicals are saying, look, this is religious. It's not something that's apart from religion at all.
So the discussion in this episode is going to continue for quite a bit more, but I did want to let you know that this will be available only for members and subscribers of the Theory of Change podcast and Flux. So if you want to get the full discussion in video, audio, and text, just go to theoryofchange.show and you can subscribe on Patreon or on Substack, and you can get the complete episode and the complete episode and transcript and video and audio of all other previous Theory of Change broadcasts. So I encourage you to do that. And thank you very much for those who do contribute and support what we're doing here. I appreciate it very much.